My father said that at Thanksgiving in front of 11 people. He never noticed the phone beside my plate or the rent payment sitting in my inbox from the building. He'd called home for 18 months. My father was still talking when his color drained away. One moment he was holding his wine glass with the comfortable authority of a man who had just been generous, who had, in his own estimation, offered his disappointing daughter a lifeline in the form of a coordinator role at his son-in-law's firm, entry-level, benefits, foundation, that kind of thing. And the next moment he was holding my phone against his chest like a man trying to stop a wound. I watched the blood leave his face. It went in sequence, the way it does when the thing you've just realized is too large to process quickly. Forehead first, then jaw, then that particular grayness around the mouth that belongs exclusively to the moment when a person understands that the story they have been telling about someone, confidently, publicly for years, was built entirely on a lie, not their lie. His. Dad, I said, did you need something? He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the screen, looked at me. 11 people at my mother's Thanksgiving table, every single one of them waiting. My Uncle Gerald set down his fork, reached for the pie knife, and cut himself another slice with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided the moment calls for composure. Your daughter, Gerald said, not looking up, is your landlord, Robert. Just that. Flat, factual. The way you read a number off a pressure gauge. My father looked at the phone, at the notification he'd picked up off the table, at the company name he'd written rent checks to for 18 months without ever once connecting it to the woman he'd just finished telling was the family disgrace. Crestview Holdings, payment received, Elmwood Apartments, Unit 4B, $47,200. His building, my company, 18 months of checks, written to me. He just hadn't known it until right now. I finished my pie. Part 1. How you build something no one can see. Let me tell you what I actually do for a living, because nobody at that table had ever asked. My name is Claire Hartwell. I'm 38 years old. I have a master's degree in finance from Ohio State, which I completed at night while working full-time at a regional development firm in Columbus. For the past 10 years, I have structured financing for commercial real estate acquisitions, which means I am the person in the room who figures out how to get a deal funded when the obvious path doesn't work. I negotiate with banks, I work with private lenders, I build holding company structures that allow investors to acquire and manage properties efficiently and with appropriate liability separation. I am, in the specific vocabulary my father has never learned, very good at my job. I started Crestview Holdings 4 years ago as a side vehicle, a small LLC through which I began acquiring residential rental properties in the mid-range Columbus market. Nothing dramatic. A duplex first, then a 4-unit, then, in year 2, a 12-unit building on the east side that cash flowed better than I'd modeled. By the time I acquired Elmwood Apartments, a 22-unit building on the north side, bought off-market for $1. $1 million with a combination of refinanced equity from the earlier properties and a bridge loan from a lender I'd worked with professionally, Crestview was generating enough income that my salary had become functionally optional. I had not told my family any of this, not because I was hiding it exactly, more because no one had asked. My father had decided, sometime around my 25th birthday, that I was the daughter who hadn't figured things out yet. Melissa was the success. 3 properties, a husband with a Tahoe, a mother-in-law who talked about her at book club. I was the one still renting, the one who needed guidance, the one for whom entry-level coordinator positions were identified and offered as kindness. Once a person decides who you are, they stop receiving information that contradicts it. I'd learned that early with my father, so I had learned to be quiet and to build things where he wasn't looking. There's a specific kind of satisfaction in that. I want to be honest about it. It is not entirely pure. There is some small, stubborn piece of me that had been waiting for the moment when the gap between who he thought I was and who I actually was would become impossible to ignore. I am human. I had a father who looked through me at every dinner table for 15 years. Of course, some part of me was keeping score, but I had not planned Thanksgiving. That I want to be clear about. What happened at my mother's table was not an ambush. It was an accident, the specific kind of accident that only happens when a person has been building something real and patient for a long time, and someone else's carelessness makes it visible before you're ready. Part 2. The table. Thanksgiving at my mother's house runs on a schedule that has not materially changed since 1994. Cocktail hour at 4, dinner at 6, dessert at 8. My father at the head of the table, my mother at the foot, Melissa and Derek on one side with their children, assorted relatives filling the rest. My Uncle Gerald, my father's older brother, has been coming since I can remember. A retired civil engineer from Dayton who says very little and observes everything, which makes him the most comfortable person in the room from my perspective. This year, cocktail hour featured Derek explaining real estate fundamentals to anyone who would hold still long enough. Derek owns 3 properties and a GMC Yukon Denali. I know the trim level because I looked it up, and it is 1 level above what makes sense for his demonstrated income. But that's Derek's business, not mine. He had found me near the cheese board. The thing people miss, he said, holding up a cracker to illustrate a point that did not require illustration, is that appreciation is the whole game. Cash flow is secondary. He paused meaningfully. You should look at REITs. Low barrier to entry. Good for people just getting started. I said that was really helpful. Derek nodded, satisfied. He had no idea he was explaining the secondary market to someone who had spent the previous Tuesday reviewing a refinancing term sheet on a property worth 8 times his annual salary. I let him finish. I let him feel used useful. This is a skill I have developed over many years of being underestimated in professional settings. The ability to receive information I already have without correcting the person delivering it, while storing the experience away in the part of my brain that keeps a very detailed record. Dinner started normally. My father opened with the observation that my cousin James had just been promoted. A corner office now, can you believe it? And from there, the conversation moved through the usual territories. Derek's properties, Melissa's kitchen renovation, the grandchildren's school performances, my mother's pie crust technique. I ate my turkey. I passed the sweet potatoes when asked. Then, between the sweet potatoes and the cranberry sauce, my father turned to look at Melissa, but the words were aimed at me. Your sister has 3 homes, Claire, and you're still renting at 38. He didn't look at me when he said it. That was the part that landed hardest. Not the words, which I had heard in various forms for years, but the direction of his gaze. As if the observation were so settled, so factual, so not worth looking at the recipient for, that he could deliver it while focusing elsewhere. 11 people heard it. Gerald's fork paused fractionally over his plate. My mother's mouth tightened the way it does when she has decided to let something pass. Melissa did her expression, that careful, practiced neither wince nor smile she had been perfecting since we were in high school. I said, and reached for the cranberry sauce. My father circled back over dessert. He always does this. He plants a point, lets it breathe, then returns to confirm it took root. I talked to Derek about a coordinator role on the administrative side of his firm. Entry level, but it's a foot in the door. Benefits, stability. He let Derek fill in the details. Derek named a salary. It was $4,200 less per month than what my father's parking space at Elmwood cost him, not his rent, his parking space, the uncovered one beside the dumpster, which he had added to his lease at month 3 because the street parking on that block was tight. That's worth considering, I said. My father nodded, picked up his wine. He was finished with me. I reached into my coat pocket and placed my phone on the table, screen down, between the water glass and the pie plate. I do this at every meal, not theater, just habit. The notifications distract me. More coffee, I said, and went to the kitchen. Part 3. The notification. I stood at my mother's kitchen counter for approximately 90 seconds. I added cream to my coffee. The right amount. I know the right amount without measuring, which is a small thing, but one I find satisfying. I listened to the sound of the dining room, which was the ordinary sound of 11 people between courses. Cutlery, low conversation, someone asking someone else to pass the rolls. Then the sound changed, not dramatically, not with any announcement. It simply became a different kind of sound, the specific absence of sound that a group of people produces when they have all stopped what they were doing simultaneously. A table at rest sounds like noise in a particular key. A table that has stopped sounds like nothing at all, but a weighted nothing, a nothing with mass. I walked back to the doorway, left to right. I read rooms this way. I do it professionally, in meetings and negotiations, and I do it by reflex everywhere else. Derek, mouth open, both hands flat on the table, the specific posture of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been revised without his permission. Melissa, completely still. Melissa is never still. She moves constantly, adjusting her hair, checking her phone, finding small things to do with her hands. Her stillness was more alarming than anything else in the room. My mother, one hand pressed to her throat. Gerald, looking at my father with an expression I had never seen on him in 38 years. My father, holding my phone against his chest, screen facing him, face the color of old chalk. I walked to my chair, sat down, placed my napkin in my lap, picked up my fork, looked at him. Dad, did you need something? He had looked at the notification before he understood what it meant. I know this because of what he'd seen. A payment confirmation from Crestview Holdings, the management company name on the tenant portal, the property address that matched the one he'd written on forms for 6 years, the amount, $47,200, the quarterly installment on his commercial lease for the retail space he occupied on the ground floor of Elmwood, which he had recently expanded, his business, my building. 18 months of payments, made promptly on the first of each quarter, to a company whose principal he had never thought to look up. Gerald said, "Your daughter is your landlord, Robert." The silence afterward was of a quality I have no adequate description for. It was not angry silence, not yet. It was the silence of 11 people recalibrating simultaneously, running backward through every dinner, every comment, every entry-level coordinator role offered as charity, every still renting at 38, every moment at every table where I had been the daughter who hadn't figured things out yet, running it all backward. I finished my pie. Derek found his voice first, and what he said changed everything. Part 4. What Derek said. How much is the building worth? He said it quietly, leaning slightly forward, looking at me with an expression I had not previously seen on Derek's face. Genuine, unperformed interest. Current appraisal is $2.8 million, I said, but I'd value it closer to 3.1 based on where the market's moving in that corridor. Derek sat back, did a brief private calculation behind his eyes. And Elmwood is one of how many? That portfolio is 4 properties currently, 91 units total. The number landed around the table. My father had not moved. He was still holding my phone, still facing the screen as if the notification might change if he looked at it long enough. The wine glass sat untouched in front of him. Melissa said very quietly, "Claire, just my name, nothing else." But in the way she said it, something shifted between us. Something that had been calcified for years by the dynamic my father had built, the 2-tier system in which she was the success And I was the cautionary tale. Something cracked. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't," I said. My Uncle Gerald refilled his coffee, set the pot down with the deliberateness of a man performing normalcy as a service to the room. "Robert," he said to my father, not unkindly, "you might want to put the phone down." My father set it on the table. Slowly, he was looking at me now, really looking for the first time in years, with the particular focus of someone seeing a person, rather than a category. I looked back at him. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that, because the story would be cleaner if I did. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated, the specific exhaustion of a person who has carried a version of themselves that no one believed in for so long that the vindication, when it finally came, had nowhere obvious to land. I said, "Did you still want to give me Derek's colleague's number? The coordinator role?" I said it without cruelty. Factually, my father looked at his plate. He didn't answer. Part 5. After the table. I went home that night to my apartment, a 2-bedroom in the short north, which I own, in the sense that it is one of the residential units in a small mixed-use building that Crestview acquired 14 months ago. And I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and my laptop, and I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had expected relief, or release, or the clean, finished feeling of something long overdue arriving at last. What I felt instead was tired. And then, beneath the tired, something else. A low, persistent ache that I recognized eventually as grief. Not dramatic grief, not the grief of acute loss. The slower kind, the grief of something that has been true for a long time and has only just been acknowledged. My father had never been curious about me. He had formed a view and furnished it comfortably, and never once tried the door. That was not Thanksgiving's fault. Thanksgiving had simply made it visible. I opened my email. There were 3 new messages. The first was from my property manager at Elmwood, a woman named Sandra Briggs, who had been managing residential properties in Columbus for 16 years and who ran the building with the specific competence of someone who takes genuine pride in her work. "Hi Claire, hope you had a good holiday. Tenant in 4B asked about early lease renewal. Want me to handle or loop you in? Routine." I told her to handle it. The second email was from my accountant, a man named Paul Renner at Renner & Associates. CPA, 20 years in commercial real estate taxation, meticulous to the point of occasionally being annoying about it, which is exactly the kind of accountant you want. He had sent the Q3 distribution summary for Crestview. I had read it earlier in the week, but I opened it again and looked at the numbers. Net operating income across the 4 properties, $312,400 for the quarter. My father's coordinator job offer, $51,800 per year, benefits, foundation, that kind of thing. I closed the laptop. The third email was from Melissa, sent at 10:47 p.m., an hour after I had left my mother's house. "Can we have lunch? Just us? I feel like I've missed something important about who you actually are, and I'd like to fix that if you're willing." I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote back, "Yes, call me this week." Part 6. The conversation. I didn't expect my father called on the Monday after Thanksgiving. 8:14 a.m. I was at my desk with coffee, reviewing a purchase agreement for a 15-unit building in Westerville that I had under contract and was planning to close before year-end. I let it ring to voicemail. He called again at 9:30. I let that one ring too. At 11 he sent a text. My father does not text. He considers it insufficiently serious as a communication medium, a view he has expressed multiple times, so the sight of his name in my messages app was itself an event. "Claire, I'd like to talk. When you're ready." I stared at it for a moment. Then I put the phone face down and went back to the purchase agreement. I did not call him back for 4 days, not out of cruelty. I thought carefully about whether I was being cruel and decided I wasn't, but because I needed to know what I wanted to say before I said it, and I needed enough distance from Thanksgiving to say it without the wrong kind of edge. I called him on the Friday morning. He answered immediately. "Claire." His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, stripped of the easy authority that usually characterized it. He sounded older, more precise, like he was choosing his words with unusual care. "I owe you an apology." I waited. He stopped, started again. "I've been telling a story about you for a long time that wasn't true, and I think I told it because it made things simpler, because I didn't have to look too closely." A long pause. "That wasn't fair." I said, "No, it wasn't. I don't know who you actually are." He said, "I realized that on Thursday night. I've been sitting with it since." This was the conversation I had not known I needed, and had not known how to ask for. My father was not a man who admitted error easily, not because he was malicious, but because he had never developed the particular musculature required, the same way you can't lift something heavy if you've never trained for it. Hearing him do it now was strange and uncomfortable, and underneath that, quietly enormous. I said, "I'd like you to know me, if you're willing to actually look." He said, "I am." I don't want to oversell that moment. One phone call does not repair 15 years of a dynamic that had been built carefully and maintained consistently. My father and I are not, even now, easy with each other. We are working towards something. It is slow work, like most work that matters. But it started there. Part 7. What Derek actually did here is the part of the story that changed the texture of everything, because it turns out the person who complicated the neat narrative most was the one I had dismissed as a footnote. Derek called me on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. I almost didn't answer. "I want to ask you something," he said when I picked up. He sounded different than he had at cocktail hour, less performed, less expansive. "And I want to acknowledge upfront that I spent Thursday evening explaining REITs to someone who owns 4 4 commercial properties, and I recognize that is a specific kind of humbling experience. I laughed. I hadn't expected to. What I wanted to ask, he said, is whether you'd be willing to have a real conversation about the business, not as family, as professionals. Derek, I should tell you, is not unintelligent. He is a man who has coasted on being the most knowledgeable person in the rooms he chooses to enter, which is a strategy that works fine until you end up in the wrong room. He had genuinely built 3 solid properties, and he understood, on some instinctive level, that he had been playing a much smaller game than he'd realized. I said, "What specifically did you want to talk about?" "I've been trying to break into the multi-unit commercial space for 2 years, he said. "I don't know the financing side well enough. I keep hitting walls I can't see around." He paused. "I think you might know where the walls are." I told him I'd meet him for coffee. We met the following Tuesday at a place on High Street. I brought a notepad. Derek brought questions that were, I will admit, better than I'd expected. Specific, financially literate, genuinely reflective of someone who had been thinking hard for several days about the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know. We talked for 2 hours. I am not going to pretend the dynamic was simple. There was an undercurrent of adjustment throughout. Derek recalibrating, me watching him do it, both of us navigating the specific awkwardness of a relationship that had been built on a false premise and was now being renegotiated in real time. But there was something underneath the awkwardness that surprised me. He was teachable, not in the eager, slightly desperate way of someone who needs to restore their ego. In the quieter, more useful way of someone who has genuinely revised their understanding of a situation and is willing to learn from the person who turned out to know more than expected. I sent him 3 articles and a financial model the following week, along with a note explaining the key leverage and debt service variables he'd need to understand before approaching commercial lenders. He read all of it and emailed back with follow-up questions that were smart enough that I answered them at length. I would not have predicted Derek. I want to acknowledge that clearly. I had written him off as a character, a prop in a story about being underestimated. He turned out to be more than that, which was useful information about the risks of my own clean narratives. Part 8. What I told my therapist. I want to include this section because otherwise the story is neater than it deserves to be. I have been seeing a therapist named Dr. Margot Finley for 6 years. She specializes in family systems and high-functioning anxiety, which is a clinical category that I resisted identifying with until about year 2 of our sessions, at which point I accepted that she was describing me accurately. She is 60 years old, direct without being blunt, and has never once let me get away with a clean analysis of something complicated. I told her about Thanksgiving in our session the following week. She listened without interrupting, which is her professional habit. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How did it feel to be seen?" I said, "Good, I think. You think?" "There was something uncomfortable about it," I said, "even though I'd been waiting for it. Because the version of you that your father didn't see had become useful to you," she said. "It gave you privacy. It gave you the freedom to build without being watched. Being invisible protected something." I sat with that. "Yes," I said. "And now? And now I have to figure out how to be known by people who spent a long time not knowing me," I said, "which is harder than being invisible." She said, "Yes, it is. But it's the only thing worth doing." I thought about that for a long time after the session. There's a particular trap in the underestimated person story. You can become so practiced at building in the dark that visibility starts to feel like danger. I had done that. The silence at cocktail hour, the agreeable MEM when Derek explained reites, the phone placed face down on the table, these were habits of concealment I had developed for self-protection and which had served me very well for years. But a habit of concealment, kept long enough, becomes its own kind of loneliness. I had been very competent and very alone. Those things were related. Part 9. The building. My father visited Elmwood Apartments for the first time in February, 3 months after Thanksgiving. I walked him through the property on a Saturday morning. Sandra Briggs met us in the lobby and gave him the operational overview with her usual dry efficiency. Occupancy rate 96%, maintenance response time averaging under 48 hours. One ongoing issue with a second-floor unit's radiator that was scheduled for service the following week. My father listened to Sandra with the attentive expression he used in professional settings. He nodded. He asked a question about the HVAC system. A good question, actually, the kind that revealed he'd been doing some reading. Afterward, Sandra went back to her office, and my father and I stood in the lobby. He looked at the ceiling, the floors, the updated mailboxes I had replaced in year 1 because the old ones were a constant tenant complaint and cost $3,400 to fix, which was one of the best $3,400 decisions I had made because satisfaction scores went up and turnover went down. "You built this," he said. "I acquired it," I said. "Sandra built the operation." "You know what I mean." "I did. 4 years ago, I owned a duplex and a spreadsheet," I said. "That's all I had." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have asked," he said. "I should have been curious about what you were doing." I said, "Yes, I'm asking now." I looked at my father, a man of 69, silver-haired, wearing the specific expression of someone who has spent 3 months sitting with a reckoning and has decided the only available response is honesty. And I told him everything, all of it, from the first duplex to the current deal in Westerville, the financing structures, the lender relationships I'd built over a decade, the failed deal in year 2 that had cost me $28,000 and taught me more than the successful ones, the way the numbers worked, and why. He listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Your grandfather would have understood understood all of this immediately. His own father, an electrician who had quietly bought 4 rental properties in Dayton in the 1970s and never talked about them, had died when my father was 22. I think I got it from him, I said. My father looked at me. Something moved across his face that I had not seen there before. I think so too, he said. Epilogue. This year, the Westerville deal closed in December. 15 units, $1.6 million. Seller financing on 20% of the purchase price from a landlord who wanted a clean exit and appreciated the speed of a buyer who didn't need to wait on bank committees. Paul Renner called it the cleanest transaction he'd seen me put together. Crestview Holdings now operates 106 units across 5 properties in the Columbus market. Net operating income for the most recent full year was $1,024 million. Melissa and I have lunch every other month. We have been, carefully and honestly, getting to know each other as adults rather than roles. It is slow and sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally very good. Derek and I have a standing monthly call about commercial real estate finance. He closed his first multi-unit deal in March, a 7-unit building in Grandview, clean financials, good bones, using a bridge loan structure I walked him through. He sent me a bottle of whiskey afterward and a note that said, "Thank you for not being petty when you had every right to be." I appreciated the honesty of that. My father and I have dinner on the second Sunday of each month. We are not easy yet. Probably we will not be easy for a long time. But he asks questions now, real ones, that require real answers, and I answer them. And sometimes he asks follow-ups that are genuinely interesting. And I think slowly, very slowly, we are building something different from what we had. It will not be the relationship I would have wanted from the beginning. That version is not available anymore. But this one is real, which is more than I could have said before Thanksgiving. At the second Sunday dinner in January, we were having coffee after the meal, and my father was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I've been thinking about what Gerald said. Your daughter is your landlord?" I said. Before that, he turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You know what your uncle said after dinner, when everyone was leaving?" I shook my head. He said, "Robert, she's been the most interesting person in this family for 20 years, and you've been looking right through her." My father set the cup down. He looked at it. He wasn't wrong. I didn't say anything. "I'm sorry it took me this long to look," he said. I thought about Dr. Finley's question. How did it feel to be seen? Uncomfortable, I had said, and hard. But sitting across from my father in January, in the small, honest space of a dinner that was still finding its shape, I thought, also this. Also, exactly this. It turned out the most powerful thing I had ever built wasn't a building. It was the patience to wait until the right person was finally ready to look.